A role model is someone others look to as a good example. A role model is someone you think is worthy of imitation, like your beloved parent, teacher, or a well-behaved celebrity. Our role models shape how we behave in life, relationships, and in making difficult decisions. Everyone has role models, but the Christians we choose as our role models are essential. Whom we choose to emulate will drastically influence the direction of our life and ministry. If you are looking for a good Christian role model, you will want to listen to Vicki Hitzges, Kent Edwards, and Nathan Norman as they begin a 3-week discussion of the lessons we can learn from one of Scripture's best ministry role models in Acts chapter 18. Welcome to CrossTalk, a Christian podcast whose goal is for us to encourage each other to not only increase our knowledge of the Bible, but to take the next step beyond information into transformation. Our goal is to bring the Bible to life, into all our lives. I'm Brian French. Today, Dr. Kent Edwards, Vicki Hitzges, and Nathan Norman continue their discussion through the book of Acts. And if you have a Bible handy, turn to Acts chapter 18, verses 1 through 4, as we join their discussion.
John Wooden is considered one of the most successful basketball coaches ever. Some say he deserves that reputation for what he did on the court. And he was impressive, winning 88 consecutive games over 4 seasons and 38 straight NCAA tournament games.
Unbelievable.
Just incredible. But many of those who played for him said that perhaps his most significant impact was the example he set off the court. Perhaps that's why he is quoted as saying, "Being a role model is the most powerful form of education." Nathan, Vicki, do you think that's true? And if so, why? Or why not?
Oh, yeah, that's absolutely true. If you are watching someone that you admire, you tend to take on their attributes. You always see that with kids. And as adults, when we become parents, all of a sudden we realize that we are our parents. Right? The things you said, I'm never going to say that to my kid. And you're like all of a sudden saying that to your kid actively, conscious of it happening, but lost at any other option to discipline your kid, right? I even find myself, I will catch myself, I will be walking. And I'm like, I am walking exactly the way my father does. Because you can't help when you're around someone to begin to emulate them and to take on their attributes.
Yeah. It's interesting. Back in the day, one of the things I found helpful was to listen to preachers I admired. Back when we had cassettes and so on, I'd be listening to these all the time. And one of the preachers I admired at the time was Roy Clements, and I'd be listening to him, and after a while, Nola would say, my wife would say to me, after I preached, "You've been listening to Roy Clements, haven't you? You kind of sound like him." Vicki, your dad told me once that we tend to emulate the, not necessarily the major attributes of a person, but sometimes the unimportant things. Because Nola would say to me, "You're breathing like Haddon." I was like, "What?"
You're breathing like him, really.
Yeah, he had a way of, when he was preaching, he would stop and then he'd make the point as he'd pause while he was inhaling.
That's funny, he did.
And I'm like, stink, I'm breathing like him. That's. And I've had friends that are in CrossTalk and I see them preach and it's hard for me to watch. I think, they look just like me and I'm so sorry.
That's funny.
Hey, who have been some of your role models?
Oh, gosh, I've had them. Nothing comes to mind off the top of my head. How about you, Nathan?
Well, certainly my parents. I think they were both phenomenal, loving Christians. And, as I got older, I remember my youth pastor, Steve Betcher. He reached out to me when I was going through childhood illness and was pretty isolated from the world. And he was willing to work through all of that to welcome me back into the church. And I could see my early teaching styles were modeled off of him. I remember Pastor Bruce Baker growing up. I mean, if you want to understand the love of Christ, I think you have to know Pastor Bruce. And he's still, I think he just preached his last sermon. I don't know how old he was. He was old when I was a little kid. So he just preached his last sermon a few months back. But oftentimes I will find when there is a difficult person or difficult situation, I will go, okay, how would Pastor Bruce relate to this person? Right. And so I'll find myself mimicking, his style. Certainly Kent, I don't know how long we've known each other now, 15 years or 16 years. It's been a while. And I found myself with that. So some of my sermons after understanding big idea preaching, I'm doing some Kent Edwardisms, and it's like, okay, let's deconstruct that a little bit and go back to Nathan.
I apologize for that.
But you can't help it. It's like artists, when artists are learning their craft, what do? They emulate the masters.
Sure.
And it's only after they've been doing this for a while, they deconstruct why that had worked. And then they figure that out. And then they have to add their own flair to it and their own personal touch. So that's a normal, natural thing.
Yeah. For me, I can think of a couple of pastors that really helped me. No one's ever heard of them. One was Mel Sharesky. He was pastor when I was a kid or just finished high school. And I was impressed by his care. He cared for people. He cared for me when I was trying to get into our denominational school, seeing if I could transfer from one school to another. He took a concern, a care, and he said, can I help? And I said, well, I guess. He brought me into his office. He got on the phone with the registrar in our denominational Bible school, and he went through my transcripts. And he said, okay, he's had Genesis. So, that counts for Pentateuch. No, Pentateuch is $5. Oh, come on, let him in. Don't be that way. And he went through, he was a pit bull. He took my side and I got in. He gave me full credit for what I had done. And he said, now, are you going to go? Yeah, I'll go.
Wow.
Another one was later on in life, a pastor named Johnny Bell. He told me that as he and his kids were young, one winter night in the cold Canadian climate, freezing cold, one of his church members had to go in for surgery. He took his old car and he drove to the hospital to minister to him before his surgery.
Wow.
And he came back knowing he only had enough money for half a tank of gas to get him halfway home. The car ran out of gas and he walked in sub-zero temperature all the rest of the way home.
Wow.
And he did that because this is my sheep. I care for them. And that just powerful image. And I think helped make me a better shepherd. Now, but every one of us has a role model, and we have a ministry as well. Every person has a ministry, professional or volunteer. God has gifted and called every one of his children to serve him in some capacity. The question I want us to explore in the next 3 weeks is, how can we serve God well? Is there a role model that, regardless of how we serve God, we can all learn from? In Acts 18, I think he's our role model for ministry. Maybe an obvious question, but do you think he's a good choice as a role model?
I can't imagine saying no.
Let's play devil's advocate here. No way.
Yeah.
No, but it is obvious that Paul gave himself wholeheartedly to ministry in all kinds of different situations. And if you want to learn from someone, you always want to learn from someone who's better than you. You don't want to learn from someone who's not.
Right.
And I think we can learn from Paul. We find Paul in a difficult situation.
In chapter 18, verse 1, it says, Paul left Athens and went to Corinth. There he met a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, who had recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had ordered all Jews to leave Rome. Paul went to see them, and because he was a tent maker as they were, he stayed and worked with them. Every Sabbath he reasoned in the synagogue, trying to persuade Jews and Greeks.
So it's easy just to skip over a paragraph like this, but I want us to spend some time and try to unpack it. Clearly, Paul is in Corinth, and he is repeating his practice of planting the gospel in influential cities so that the gospel could spread across the known world. And Corinth was a significant city, wasn't it?
Still is.
Yeah, it was the capital of its Roman province and a leading commercial city in Greece. I mean, there was a lot of money coming into Corinth. I don't know if you've looked on a map, but it is strategically located between the main trade route between Asia and Rome. Corinth was built on a narrow isthmus that joined the Aegean and Ionian seas from east to west, so that all trade that was moving from east to west or west to east always went through that isthmus. So there was all kinds of implications from that. There was money from trade. There was multiculturalism. All kinds of religions and different cultures lived there. In fact, so much that they had the famous Isthmian Games. I mean, they were like the modern day Olympics. People came from all over the world to compete with one another. It was a huge tourist boom. So with these games taking place and all kinds of tourists flooding into the region, one of the things they needed was temporary housing, right?
Sounds like it. People would come and go. Sure.
Sure. So how do you think in the ancient world they would provide temporary housing for these tourists who are coming for the games?
The Hilton. No.
Probably not hotels.
They would use tents, of course.
Right. And is that significant for our story?
Well, probably because Paul was a tent maker, and we just got introduced to Aquila and Priscilla, and they were tent makers.
Right. So why did Priscilla and Aquila come to Corinth? Well, they were Jews, I'm assuming from the context, Jewish Christians, who left because of persecution. The emperor wanted them out of Rome. And they chose Corinth because, hey, that's where they could make money. And Paul arrives and says, hey, fellow Christians, and I could join them because I can make money. Corinth was only 50 miles from Athens. Paul was a tent maker. It's a perfect situation for them both. But it is interesting that Paul chose to work as a tent maker in Corinth. After all, last week we saw that he was ministering in Athens, and he was a first-class philosopher. He was operating in the high end of society. But now he's taking on the role of a tent maker. Why do you think he did that?
It's marketplace ministry. He now gets into contact with all of those people who are coming from all around the world who need a tent to see the games. And as he's putting together their order and making their tents, he can, hey, what do you believe? Why are you here? You know, have you heard about Jesus? You know, what? You know, this guy raised from the dead. No way. And he can tell them the good news of the gospel of Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
And he also gets to, raise money so he can, eat, live.
Now, did he have a right to make money from his preaching, from his ministry?
Absolutely.
How do you know that?
Well, he said so in 1 Corinthians 9.
He said that to the Corinthian church, didn't he?
Right. And the other apostles agreed. In 1 Corinthians 9, it says, who plants a vineyard and does not eat its own grapes? Who tends a flock and does not drink the milk? Whoever plows the field and threshes the wheat should also share in the harvest. If we have sown spiritual seeds among you, is it too much if we reap a material harvest from you? But we did not use this right. On the contrary, we put up with anything rather than hinder the gospel of Christ.
He didn't want to hinder the gospel, so he chose to work with his hands. How would making a salary from the Christians in Corinth hinder the gospel? What is he talking about here? What was he afraid of?
Well, I imagine because it's such a multicultural area and there's a lot of people coming in and out, that also means there's a lot of shysters. There's a lot of grifters and people coming in with false motivations, false religious motivations, who are offering to give people some sort of spiritual experience in exchange for money. And so Paul doesn't want to be included with them. He does not have mixed motives for preaching Christ. He is preaching Christ solely because Christ is true and he's risen from the dead, and everyone should have an opportunity to respond to that good news.
Sure. And also, as you alluded to earlier, if he took money, that might separate him from the majority of the people living in Corinth. Remember back last chapter, we pointed out that he was acting as a philosopher, right?
Right.
very high-ranking member of Greek society. And why did he take on that role? Do you remember what Luke told us?
It says in verse 21, all the Athenians and the foreigners who lived there spent their time doing nothing but talking about and listening to the latest ideas.
Ah, so if everyone was talking philosophy, he became a philosopher, right?
Right.
So that he could identify with the people. There'd be less of a gap between them, he himself and them, that the gospel had to bridge. But here in Corinth, it was much different. Yes, there was a lot of money in Corinth, but not all the people had a lot of money. The people at the top of society had a lot of money, but the majority of people were kind of blue-collar workers or slaves. The vast majority were blue-collar or slaves, ordinary people. I mean, you even see that today in America, right? There's a huge income gap between the top and the bottom of society, isn't there?
Yeah, sure is.
So what Paul is doing is saying, even though I could put on airs, even though I could identify with the upper class, I want to identify in all humility with the majority of people who need to hear the gospel. I'm going to put aside my pride, become a blue-collar worker in order to identify with the people in Corinth who need to hear the gospel. I mean, isn't that what Paul said that Jesus did in Philippians 2?
Oh, I love this passage. He says in Philippians 2, who, referring to Jesus, being in the very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness, and being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself.
Jesus did not come with all of his glory. He laid that aside so that he could identify with the people who needed to hear the gospel. Reminds me of Hudson Taylor, doesn't it, in China?
He became Chinese.
He did.
He ate their food, wore their clothing, sent kids to, spoke their language.
Became a cobbler.
Yeah.
Yeah. He did everything he could to identify with the people so there would be no barrier for the gospel. So they would be able to hear it and see it more clearly.
And the irony, I mean, I guess we're looking back in hindsight as 2020, but he got so criticized for doing that. The mentality was, in order to come to faith in Christ, you have to become a Westerner first so that you can understand the gospel. And Hudson Taylor is like, no, it's ridiculous. Look what Paul did. I got to become like them.
And it's interesting that in a Jewish context, this was a huge, huge issue because you just didn't see the leaders of the Jewish faith acting this way. In fact, Jesus talks about it in Matthew 23, doesn't he?
He says, Then Jesus said to the crowd and to his disciples, the teachers of the law and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. So you must be careful to do everything they tell you, but do not do what they do, for they do not practice what they preach. Everything they do is done for people to see. They make their phylacteries wide and the tassels on their garments long. They love the place of honor at banquets. In the most important seats in the synagogues, they love to be greeted with respect in the marketplace and to be called rabbi by others.
So the Jewish leaders of the day liked to distinguish themselves as above the people. Not one of them. And this idea to be seen as superior, do we ever see that today?
Well, historically, you could see in churches where the pastor preaches is up on this pedestal. So it's on the stage, but that's not high enough. So then you've got to go up about a floor and a half of steps.
I've seen those.
And then the preacher stands behind this massive pulpit looking down upon them like Caesar in order to deliver the address. Certainly. But in today's day and age, absolutely. We have people looking to serve rather than be served. And I can't remember if I've shared this story or not on this podcast, but I remember talking to a pastor, a former pastor of a church that I was serving at one point, and we're out to lunch and everything. And he goes, "Hey, how's the church treating you?" And I was like, "Oh, the church is treating me fine. Everything's going well." And he goes, oh, good. I'm glad to hear that. That church didn't know how to serve its pastor.
Ooh.
And I was like, what? Excuse me? Yeah, they didn't know how to serve their pastor. I'm like, pastor's not there to be served. The pastor is there to be the chief servant to the people. And oh my good, I couldn't believe that he said that. It's unreal. Yeah, the pastor should be the chief servant, not the one who is being served by the congregation. But yeah, people are there. Oh, how will this ministry benefit me? What's in ministry for me? Rewards in heaven, my friend. And pain and suffering on this side.
When Jesus was talking about what it meant to follow him, he didn't say it's all about you, did he? Especially in Matthew 8.
It says, then a teacher of the law came to Jesus and said, Teacher, I will follow you wherever you go. And Jesus replied, Foxes have dens and birds have nests, but the Son of Man has no place to lay his head.
Ooh. That's not coming for what you can get, is it?
No.
And he was pretty clear in Matthew 20 when he was talking to the mother of Zebedee's sons, right?
It says, then the mother of Zebedee's sons came to Jesus with her sons and kneeling down asked a favor of him. What is it you want? He asked. And she said, grant that one of these two sons of mine may sit at your right and the other at your left in the kingdom. That's a gutsy thing.
That is bold. I bet she's like, look, the future belongs to the bold.
That's right.
Worst he can say is no, right?
Yeah. I don't have it now.
So what did she want for her boys? What was her request?
To rule for eternity right next to Jesus for her boys. One on the right, one on the left.
Power and authority and prestige.
That's right.
Was this a temptation only for these boys and their mother?
No. The other disciples were arguing about it when they found out about this.
They were mad.
Yeah.
When the 10 heard about it, they were indignant with the two brothers. Jesus called them together and said, you know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them. Not so with you. Hear this, you guys. Not so with you. Like, stop it. Instead, whoever wants to be great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be your slave. Just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many.
I don't know about you, but I am impressed by the example the Apostle Paul sets in this passage. He comes to Corinth that he wants to minister to. He lays aside the prestige that he had in Corinth. Even though he had a fine education, was a marvelous scholar, he picked up the tools of a blue-collar trade and began to work to feed himself. He didn't want to let his pride get in the way of effectiveness of ministry. He ministered with humility. If the Apostle Paul is a role model for ministry, then maybe a couple of questions that we all can ask ourselves is, how can I best serve my Lord with the gifts God has given me? How can I be most effective? How can I, in humility, lay beside my desire for glory so that his glory is manifest? One of the secrets of ministry effectiveness is humility. We see it in Paul. May people see it in us.
We should banish pride when we carry out any ministry God has given us. A successful ministry, a ministry that honors God, is a humble ministry. I trust that today's discussion of God's Word has been helpful and served as an encouragement to not just be hearers of the Word, but doers. Together, let's bring God's Word to life, to our lives this week. The CrossTalk podcast is a production of CrossTalk Global, equipping biblical communicators so every culture hears God's voice. To find out more, or to support the work of this ministry, please visit www.crosstalkglobal.org. You can also support this show by sharing it on social media and telling your friends. Tune in next Friday as we continue our discussion through the book of Acts and discover the second essential attribute for successful ministry. Be sure to join us.
If you are looking for a good Christian role model, you'll want to listen to Vicki Hitzges, Kent Edwards, and Nathan Norman.
Kent Edwards.
Just those three. Nope, just those three. Although, for the record, Vicki Hitzges is the best role model out of this trio.
Oh, shoot.
As they begin a 3-week... Is that even a question? As they begin a 3-week discussion.